Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to more Conversations in the Digital Age. Republican presidential hopeful Donald Trump has said that Mexican immigrants are bad for the U.S. economy and that illegal immigrants, mostly from Mexico, should be deported along with their children, whether or not American-born. Trump's extraordinary proposal catapulted him to the top of the Republican polls, although many Republicans feared he had done lasting damage to the Republican Party, particularly among Latino voters. With us is Shannon O'Neil. Shannon O'Neil is a senior fellow in Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's the author of the best-selling book, Two Nations Indivisible, Mexico, the United States, and the Road Ahead. Shannon, welcome back to the program.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, tell us about immigration. What has been the history of Mexican immigration to the United States?
Well, we've always, because of proximity, had a very close relationship. And, some Mexicans will say it isn't them that moved to the United States, but the border that moved on them. So we've had, hundreds of years of Mexicans in the United States who then became U.S. citizens. But the real wave started happening probably about 30 years ago. And then beginning in the 1970s through the 80s, 90s until today, we've seen this wave of Mexicans come up into the United States and make a home here, some just to work and to go back, and then some really to settle here. That wave has been declining, and actually for the last almost 10 years, we've seen declines to the point today where there's a net zero effect. There's about the same number coming as going back each year, but it has seen this lasting movement for the last 30 plus years.
Now, are most of these immigrants documented?
About half are and about half aren't. So many come in with legal visas, whether they're to work here, whether to reunite with family or the like, but another half, probably somewhere between 5 and 6 million people in the United States, are undocumented Mexicans.
Well, and the ones that come illegally, how do they get here?
Many come across the border, right? We see lots of unlawful entries across the border. Some will come in on visas and then overstay their visas, but more, particularly from Mexico, come across the southern border.
And they don't come over at border crossings. Are they smuggled across the border, or places where there's no fence or where there's no natural barrier?
It's a mix. As the United States, over the last 10 years, we've doubled the resources and the manpower along the border. So we've really filled in the spaces between the ports of entry. So yes, some do come across those places, but increasingly they're actually coming through the ports of entry. They're using documents that are not their own. They're coming in, being smuggled in through cars or trucks and the like. So they're actually coming through those entry points, but in ways that are unlawful.
And many have died trying to come into the United States, haven't they?
They have.
Thirst or starvation?
Yeah, we have seen an increase in those that die in trying to get to the United States.
And they have to cross rugged country, and they really don't have much assistance.
Yeah, they're not coming for a fun time here. These are people who are really coming to support themselves, support their families, find a better life for them.
Now, Trump wants to build a wall. We already have miles and miles of fencing, don't we? Under Bush, wasn't there a fence act that was supposed to separate us from Mexico?
There is. So we already have almost 700 miles worth of fence along an almost 2,000-mile border. And part of the reason not building in the other places is the difficulty of doing it, the distance between things. But really, when we think about our immigration policy, building a wall on our southern border reflects a reality of 10 or maybe 20 years ago. It doesn't reflect the reality of immigration today. One part of immigration is that actually Mexicans are not the main group coming into the United States today. There are many more people coming from Asia than from Mexico. And two, 60% of people who come into the United States and are undocumented here don't come across the southern border. They come in on visas that then they overstay. So building a wall on the southern border will do nothing for the 60% that come in other ways.
Well, he wants to make it criminal to overstay a visa, a visitor's visa. I mean, is that good policy?
We it is illegal to overstay a visa. So those are issues that are there already. The challenge is, how do we enforce that? How do we really monitor the people who come in? And so criminalizing it isn't going to change the way we control that back and forth.
Now, you said that Mexicans are going back and forth across the border. What is the state of the Mexican economy now?
So the Mexican economy has become much more stable, with albeit slow growth. It's incredibly tied to the United States. But one of the biggest changes at the same time this migration wave was happening was a real transformation of that economy. It used to be one driven by commodities. Today it's one driven by manufactured goods. I used to be one very closed to the world. Today it's one of the most open in terms of free trade agreements, in terms of commerce with countries all over the world, but particularly with the United States. So this is an economy today that's incredibly open and incredibly tied to the United States. And so that is a big shift, and in part why we're seeing movements of people back and forth. We need to remember, too, it's not just Mexicans coming to the United States. Americans go to Mexico. There's an estimated 1 million Americans that live in Mexico, largely for work reasons, and that really attests to this integration we've seen of the two economies.
Well, and you say Mexico is experiencing slow growth, but in certain of the states, growth is of Asian dimensions, isn't that right?
Exactly. One thing that's fascinating about Mexico, the overall growth rates are 2.5%. But if you separate the states, you see very different outcomes. So some states like Querétaro, which is home to its aerospace industry, is growing 14%. Aguascalientes, which is home to a lot of its auto parts, growing 12%. Other states in the north, particularly, those tied most closely to the United States, are growing incredibly quickly. It's those in the south, really disconnected from the U.S., that are seeing declines.
Now, what has been our experience with the Mexican immigrants who've come to this country trying to make a home here and then have stayed, and they've had children who were born here under the 14th Amendment and under the decisions of the Supreme Court? Those natural-born citizens, even if their parents are here illegally, are citizens of the United States, like you and me.
That's true. They're American citizens as well.
What is their lot here? Are they well off? Are they happy here? Are they productive? What are they doing for the American economy?
Well, there's roughly 30 to 35 million Mexican Americans in the United States. So some of them have been here for as many generations as perhaps your family or mine. You know, many. Others are much newer. So you see all different types of relationships. Most of these contribute sizably to our economy. Mexican immigrants, just like immigrants from all different groups, are much more likely to start their own company. They're much more likely to create jobs, especially at the small and medium enterprise side. They contribute taxes. They contribute by buying goods, by raising housing prices because of increased demand. Almost every careful study of cities, of towns, of states, of regions show that immigration, Mexican immigration being part of that, is beneficial overall to the local, the state, or the federal economy. So this has been an incredibly important part of the United States.
Well, the mayor of Laredo, Texas, who has a constituency of rock-ribbed conservatives, wants to encourage immigration. He says it's good for the economy of Texas. And Governor Rick Perry of Texas, certainly no liberal, has also said he wants more immigration from Mexico. So they see a net plus to the American economy.
Well, you know, Texas is one of those states mostly tied to Mexico. And Texas actually sends $100 billion worth of goods, of exports, to Mexico each year. So it employs hundreds of thousands of Texans. But Texas isn't alone in that. Over half of the U.S. states, Mexico is its number one or number two export destination. So many companies, so many jobs actually depend on their economy today.
President Nieto of Mexico came to Washington in January, met with President Obama, and he talked about economic growth and he talked about economic cooperation. And he talked about raising living standards in Mexico. Has he been successful in doing this?
So far, no. Right? Mexico's growth, particularly these divides you see. In some places, living standards are increasing, particularly those in the north where growth has been quick. But in the south, always traditionally the poorer part of Mexico, it's stagnated and they haven't found a way to jumpstart that growth. And so one challenge Mexico has is we see a divide, a geographic one between a prosperous north and a much poorer south, but also one that will lead to political divides over time. Now, this president, Peña Nieto, has put into place a whole series of reforms. He's opened up the energy sector. He's trying to change the education sector, trying to change the financial sector, putting in new antitrust laws to break down monopolies and oligopolies. And some of these, I think, if implemented, will really jumpstart the economy, but they're going to be a longer-term process.
Mexico and the United States are parties to the North American Free Trade Agreement, which to relax tariff barriers. Has this been successful for Mexico and for the United States?
You know, partly NAFTA, now 20 plus years in, it has been one of the driving forces of this increased trade. And so between the two nations, we've seen trade quadruple over this time. The back and forth is over $500 billion, $500 billion. And what's really been a shift with NAFTA has been the integration of production. And one thing that's very special with Mexico and the U.S. relationship is for every import coming into Mexico, so what we would consider, quote unquote, made in Mexico, 40% of that import was actually made in the United States by U.S. workers. So a part was made here, it's taken to Mexico, it's worked on there, it's brought back here, maybe worked on again before it's sold somewhere. And that is different than almost any other country. Canada's the next closest, 25% is made in the U.S. But when we think about the EU, we think about China, Brazil, it's less than 5%. Almost nothing is done by American workers. So that's a very different relationship. And partly and largely, that's because of NAFTA.
Now, what about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Hillary Clinton now opposes and Bernie Sanders is for? What about that? Is that going to benefit Mexico? Is that going to benefit the United States?
You know, that should benefit all of the countries that are part of it. We have some 12 countries that are involved. There's others that want to join. Indonesia's president was just here and said he'd like to be the first in line to join the signed agreement, which has yet to be ratified by the United States or the other nations. I do think this will help. It will bring together like-minded nations, some 40% of global GDP, and it will lower barriers, tariffs, but even more important ones, intellectual property ones, government procurement, other kinds of regulations that stop the back and forth. And overall, I think for the United States, for Mexico, for Canada, for North America, this will be a very important opening of other markets where we can be competitive.
Do you expect that Mexico will, in time, become one of the top 20, top 15 economies in the world?
Well, Mexico's already in the top 15, but
in the top 15.
It's 13 or 14, depending on how you measure it. But I do think it has this chance to grow, in part because of its linkages to the United States. I think that makes it much stronger. In part, its demographics are very favorable. It's still going through what they call a demographic boom, so lots of working-age people versus young and old. And in part, it is a fairly open, competitive, and macroeconomically sound economy. There's lots you can do there in terms of investing and growing. It provides a real platform. So I think if the country pulls some of their problems together, deals with some of the issues they have, which are true, things like rule of law and corruption and the like, if they can tackle some of these issues, I think it will have a prosperous future.
Well, let's get to rule of law and corruption, because what Trump seems to have played into is a very unfavorable image for Mexico in the United States. It's supposed to be filled with narco-terrorists. Trump said they come here and they commit all sorts of criminal acts. Then he sort of softened that statement. But we certainly have a feeling among many Americans that the security situation there is bad, that corruption is rampant, that the drug lords reign supreme and aren't prosecuted. El Chapo went to jail. He escaped. The most notorious criminal in the world. Where are they headed in terms of the security position?
I mean, this is their single most important challenge. How do you improve security? But more generally, how do you improve rule of law? Because that will bring security if you can actually punish the guilty and free the innocent. It will also matter for businesses, for others. Can you actually provide the public good that you need to have a prosperous society? There have been some steps forward on this, particularly involving the narco traffickers, involving taking down some of those that are part of organized crime. Much of it in combination with the United States, working very closely with us. But this is their remaining challenge. And one of the things they're in the process of doing over the next 6 months to a year is transitioning from a written system, a sort of Napoleonic code, to one that's more accusatorial, more oral trials-based system. And that transition, there's some states that have gone ahead and done it, and it does seem to really improve outcomes. It makes sure that trials move much more quickly. They seem to be much fairer, and it does seem to really prosecute and convict the guilty, that there's much more satisfaction with the general population with that sort of system. But it's a huge challenge for them to actually implement the system. They have to do everything from building courtrooms to changing law school curriculum to retraining the almost 30,000 people within the current system to abide under the new rules. So this is not going to be an easy process, but I do think in the long run it will help them with their security problems.
And build escape-proof prisons from which the likes of El Chapo can't escape.
Yes, after his escape, what they've decided to do is actually, again, start extraditing some of the most notorious criminals to the United States. So they're using our prisons for the time being.
Well, perhaps more reliable, although not necessarily. Now, Mexicans come here, and they leave their families in Mexico, and they earn money here, and they like to send money back to them. This is a lot of money. It's $12 billion in the first months of 2015. They call them remittances. Now, Trump has a brainy idea. He wants to use the remittances to build the wall. Is any of this realistic?
Well, you imagine these are people who work in all sorts of industries, landscaping, childcare, construction, hospitality, you name it. They're saving all their money and they're sending it back to their family. Is that something that you could confiscate to build a wall? It seems a bit far-fetched, and particularly since the ones he's most worried about are not those that are earning legally and sending back to their families, but those that are undocumented. So if you've already pushed them into the shadows, if they're already outside the banking system, outside of these regular transmission lines, how would one even go about doing that, much less the fairness of taking money that someone's actually earned with their sweat and blood?
There was a close, and there's always been a close diplomatic relationship between the United States and Mexico, certainly since the 1940s. Is that relationship going to be harmed by claims that we have to deport Mexican immigrants, we have to build a wall, we have to seize Mexican money that's being sent back to Mexican families? How do you see that as playing out?
Sure. Well, we've always had a complicated relationship with Mexico, a very deep one, multifaceted, but complicated. And they, perhaps justifiably in many years, have been a bit suspicious of U.S. motives. So this type of rhetoric coming from Trump or others doesn't help that side. But, there are other people who are stepping forward and have a very different message. Most of the Democrats have a very different message than Trump. And in fact, even as we see some states, some places crack down on undocumented immigrants, we have over 200 cities in the United States, including all of the big ones, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and others, that have declared themselves sanctuary cities. So these are places that are welcoming immigrants, whether you have papers or not. They're not going to ask your status if their police officer sees you or if you go and talk to them about some problem that you've had. So I do think there's very different approaches in the United States, and many places are moving in a much more open and welcoming way.
Well, the Mexican Foreign Ministry was quick to respond to Mr. Donald Trump. He says that he accused Trump of racism in his remarks, and he said, quote, "Anyone who understands the depth of the U.S.-Mexico relationship realizes that those proposals are not only prejudiced and absurd, but would be detrimental to the well-being of both societies." And do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. Look, we are, whether you like it or not, deeply, indelibly intertwined, whether it's through the people that we've been talking about, through the economies that we share, through the geography, the climate. All of these things are tied to each other. So trying to set up a wall, which, famously Janet Napolitano, when she was governor along the border, said if you build a 50-foot wall, someone will show up with a 51-foot ladder. That's not a way to resolve some of the conflicts or challenges we have in the bilateral relationship.
Well, in your book, where you argue we are two nations indivisible, you talk about the politics of antagonism. It's a wonderful label for it. I mean, do you think Trump has bought into the politics of antagonism with his remarks?
He's leading the politics of antagonism.
He's the Pied Piper of antagonism.
One thing that's interesting, you look at many other diaspora in the United States, whether it's Irish or Italian or most famously the Israeli diaspora. And whenever someone says something against those various groups, there's a very quick reaction from the business community, from other groups in that feel harmed by that. And one thing that has not yet happened with Mexicans and Mexican Americans is really forming of that kind of lobby that would have it be costly if you sort of speak out against Mexicans. I do think that's something.
Well, if they're here illegally, they're not likely to come out and lobby Congress for better treatment.
But we have 30 million Mexican Americans who are painted with that same brush in many ways. And what I think will be interesting as we come up and we're heading into this next election, how important the Hispanic but the Mexican American voting demographic will be, since it's almost 2/3 of that Hispanic demographic. And particularly in states like Florida, Colorado, Nevada, these are swing states where Hispanic population, much of it Mexican American, is 15% of the voters. So we could see, we'll find out in the election, do we see a repudiation of the kind of sayings that Trump is coming out when these voters actually come up and show up at the ballot?
At this point, what do polls show? Do you know? Do you have any sense of that?
You know, the polls are very similar to the way they were before. If you remember, for Hispanics, Mexican Americans, and others went for Barack Obama incredibly high, 70+%. And it looks that way again. And the more that Trump or others, often Republican candidates, come out, the worse they look within this demographic, which is a demographic that's growing every day. So between now and the election, almost 1 million Hispanics will turn 18 and be able to vote next November, a year from now.
Tell us about political reform in Mexico. I'm fascinated by this guy, Neto, who's kind of a throwback to the party that was in power, and then Calderon came in with another party. What are the politics of the Mexican government?
You know, it's interesting. He has, in some ways, a very forward-looking agenda. He's, introduced an energy reform that, for the first time in 70 years, will allow foreign investment to come in to Mexico and really make the most of that sector. He's introduced financial reforms, education reforms. He's introduced a political reform that will allow, for the first time also in 70-plus years, politicians to be reelected. Before, a mayor or a legislature or a senator, no one could be reelected. Now they'll be able to, which hopefully will increase a bit accountability. If you want to be reelected, you actually have to follow through on your campaign promises. So there's lots of things he has done. At the same time, there's pretty worrisome signs that his administration has not really taken on those more shady areas of power, right? They haven't really reined in some of the corruption or the old backroom ways of doing things. And I think there's a question, can you really put in this modern agenda and really make it happen, become globally competitive, if you don't also deal with some of this more opaque way of doing things, or the old school way of doing things? I think that's the challenge. What has happened under his administration, which I think is very different and really reflects the strength of Mexico's democracy, is opposition parties, civil society groups, average citizens have really been speaking out about this and forcing the government to take on the corruption, to try to make it more accountable than the past. And that really is something new. It doesn't have to do with his government, but it has to do with a changed Mexico and Mexican society.
So if you were advising a candidate for President of the United States on Mexican policy and immigration policy, what planks would you advise that candidate should adopt?
Well, in immigration policy, I don't see a way that we resolve the challenges we have, the real rule of all challenges we have, and maintain the competitiveness of the U.S. economy and economic growth without some sort of comprehensive immigration reform. This is one that deals with the 11+ million undocumented immigrants here, allows them to find a way to stay.
Both Mexican, half of them are Mexican.
Half are Mexican, or half from other countries all over the world. Exactly. But they're very deeply embedded, most of them, in our society. Many have kids who are U.S. citizens or spouses or others.
So what would be the standard? I mean, Trump says we should appraise it on the merits and go into the merits of each person who's here and decide whether or not they should be deported. And if you
Sounds like a lot of paperwork.
You start down that road.
But I think, right, you can have certain things that they need to do. They need to pay taxes. They need to show that they're hardworking citizens. They need to learn English. There's lots of things you could do, but you find a path that then they can meet. That's one way. Another way is to restructure our current immigration system. So those that would come here that have ties. Most people come here because they have networks. They have family, or they have friends, or they have job opportunities. Those that have that can find a reasonable way to come. And today, the challenge for someone from Mexico or Central America is there's no line to get into, or the line is so long, it would take 20, 25 years to come here, that it's unrealistic. So can we adjust those policies to make it incentivize them to really wait in line? So I think those are real issues. How do we restructure our immigration system for the reality we have today and the reality of what we would like for the future? And one thing to remember for the U.S. is, as we look forward, we're having a generational change happen. And the baby boomer generation is about 10 million more workers than the next generation, the Generation X. And so we're going to have a gap in our labor system that's going to need to be filled from somewhere. And immigrants are often the place that will come from. So that's what I see. In terms of engaging Mexico for the next government, this is one of our most important relationships. It's one of the most multifaceted. It's hard to think of another country where we share so many issues. We have so many things on the table. And so there will be some things that will be very easy. It's a natural ally for us on economic issues at multilateral forum. It's a natural ally for us on climate change, on financial reform, on lots of issues like that. But there's also issues where there's going to be some tensions. And along the border, immigration is also one that will continue to be something we need to work through. So setting aside the space and some top people to really engage on a consistent basis is what's needed to make the most of it.
So would you favor vigorous enforcement of our present immigration laws and strengthening the border crossings to prevent more of an influx of Mexican immigration?
I mean, as the numbers show, Mexicans have stopped coming. Right? This is not the biggest issue.
There's a decline. They haven't stopped coming.
There's a net zero. So those coming in and those going out are net zero or even lower. There are other countries. Many of the people coming across the Mexican border are actually from Central America, and that's another issue. Smaller countries, but their flows have been unabated. And actually the biggest influxes of immigrants, both illegal and some illegal, are coming from Asia.
From Asia. So unfortunately, we've run out of time. But I wanted to thank you so much for coming by.
Thanks, Jim.
Is Trump right? I mean, should we deport the illegal aliens in this country? Shannon O'Neil.
It would hurt our economy and our country.
It would hurt our economy and our country. Thank you for coming by. Thank you for coming by. Please tune in next week for more Conversations in the Digital Age. I'm Jim Zirin. Please visit our website, www.digitalage.org. All the best and take care.